You promised me you would not let them take her.
The frail voice cut through the howling dust storm outside, snapping like a dry winter twig inside the bitter cold of the desolate cabin. Garrett knelt beside the rotting mattress, his broad shoulders blocking the freezing draft that whistled through the cracked timber. He removed his weathered hat, clutching the brim, with calloused hands that had tamed wild horses and broken unforgiving earth. He watched the fading life drain from the woman who had once pulled him from the edge of his own grave. 20 years had carved deep lines into Martha's face. Now, death was smoothing them out, leaving only a desperate, feral terror in her pale eyes. I gave you my word, Garrett rumbled, his voice as low and steady as grinding stone. I keep my word. But the burden of that promise was far heavier than a simple dying wish. The secret binding them together was a debt paid in blood, a story that the fierce frontier winds would soon try to tear apart. Stay until the end of this memory to see if a broken man can truly mend a shattered soul. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight to see how far this tale travels across the miles. The storm battered the sagging cabin roof, rattling the iron hinges of the heavy oak door. Garrett shifted his sharp, observant gaze toward the far corner of the dim, dusty room. There, huddled deep in the shadows, sat the girl. Only, Emmeline was no longer a girl. She was a towering mountain of a woman. Even crouched against the splintering floorboards, her sheer size was staggeringly powerful. She possessed a colossal frame, built of thick, heavy muscle, forged by a lifetime of brutal physical labor. Her arms, wrapped tight around her long legs, displayed the sweeping power of a seasoned lumberjack. Her massive thighs strained against the fabric of a faded, torn blue dress. Wild dust and gray ash clung to her long, tangled light brown hair, hiding a face that held the gentle, terrified eyes of a trapped woodland doe. She was a giant, a creature of overwhelming physical dominance, yet she trembled violently like a fragile leaf in a hurricane. The ruthless townsfolk called her a monster. They whispered cruel, vicious things behind closed doors, spitting venom about the unnatural strength she possessed and the sheer, intimidating bulk of her wide shoulders. They did not see the quiet dignity in her sorrow. They did not see the profound kindness living inside her chest. They only saw a wild beast they wished to drive out or destroy. Emmeline watched Garrett with wide, tear-filled eyes. She expected him to look upon her with the same harsh disgust the others always wore. She expected him to take one look at her massive, wildly muscular body and walk away, leaving her to starve alone in the unforgiving winter cold. Garrett did not flinch. He did not look away. He held her gaze with a quiet, unyielding calm. He saw the thick dust covering her trembling muscles. He saw the brutal hardship etched deep into her rough, calloused hands. He saw a lonely child locked inside an imposing fortress of flesh and bone, absolutely terrified of the cruel world outside. Garrett. Martha choked on a rough, wet cough that rattled her fragile ribs. He turned his complete attention back to the dying woman. He leaned closer, resting his heavy, scarred hand gently over her frail, shaking fingers. The stark contrast between his weathered, dependable strength and her fading life painted a vivid picture of the brutal frontier existence. I am here, Garrett murmured. They will come for the land. Martha breathed, her sunken chest shuddering with the immense effort of speaking. But it is not just the land they want. They want to cage my girl. They want to break her spirit because they fear her size. They will not touch her, Garrett replied. His voice held no fiery anger, only absolute, immovable certainty. He was a man shaped by years of hard labor and silent suffering. He possessed a stoic resolve that required no loud shouting. His quiet presence alone was an impenetrable fortress. Emmeline let out a soft, broken sob. The delicate sound was surprisingly tender, coming from such a massive, imposing chest. She buried her face deep into her thick forearms, rocking slowly back and forth on the floor. The wooden floorboards creaked loudly under her immense weight. Every movement she made was a vivid testament to raw, unchecked physical power, yet she used all of that immense power to make herself appear as small and as insignificant as possible. Garrett felt a heavy, lingering ache settle deep behind his ribs. He understood exactly what it meant to be cast aside by society. He understood the profound, hollow loneliness of being feared by the very people you wish to protect. "She has never harmed a single living soul," Martha whispered, a solitary tear sliding down her hollow, pale cheek. "She carried the heavy firewood when she was only 6 years old. She pulled the iron plow when the work mule died. She has the heavy hands of a giant, but she has the pure heart of an angel." "I know," Garrett said softly, his weathered face showing a rare glimpse of deep empathy. He did not just know, he owed his very breath to the unyielding kindness of this forgotten family. Now it was finally time to balance the old ledger. He would take the giant child into his permanent care. He would bring her to his isolated, quiet ranch, located on the far edge of the jagged mountain peaks. He would stand firmly between her and the vicious cruelty of the valley below. The winter storm raged violently outside, throwing a relentless flurry of sharp ice against the clouded windowpane. The dying fire in the stone hearth cast dancing, flickering shadows across Emmeline's towering silhouette. Martha squeezed his rugged fingers with the very last ounce of her failing strength. Her shallow breathing turned erratic, becoming a terrible rattling sound that filled the tiny, cold cabin. Emmeline raised her head. The giant woman pushed herself up from the dusty floor. She uncoiled, her massive limbs standing to her full, staggering height. Her broad shoulders nearly grazed the low, wooden beams of the cabin ceiling. She took a slow, heavy step toward the crude bed. Her thick leather boots thudded heavily against the wooden planks. "Mama," Emmeline breathed. Her voice was rich, deep, and terribly thick with unshed tears. Garrett stepped back into the shadows, granting the grieving daughter the sacred space she desperately needed. Emmeline dropped out heavily to her knees beside the wooden bed. The forceful impact rattled the surrounding furniture. She reached out with arms as thick as tree trunks, her massive, calloused hands hovering nervously over her mother, as if deeply afraid her immense physical strength would accidentally shatter the fragile woman. Gently, with an agonizing and beautiful tenderness, Emmeline brushed a loose lock of gray hair from Martha's damp forehead. The visual contrast was profoundly heartbreaking. The heavily muscular giant crying silent, bitter tears over the tiny, fading mother who had always protected her. Martha smiled, revealing a faint, ghostly expression of pure, unconditional love. "My beautiful girl," she whispered softly into the cold room. Emmeline wept openly. She leaned her large head down, resting it gently against her mother's chest, sobbing with a deep, rumbling grief that physically shook the very walls of the timber cabin. Garrett stood silently by the door, remaining a stoic sentinel in the darkness. He watched the terrible heartbreak unfold, feeling the heavy weight of the past years pressing down upon his broad shoulders. He mentally prepared his guarded heart for the arduous journey ahead. He knew the corrupt town would not let this go easily. He knew he would eventually have to fight for her peace. Suddenly, Martha's eyes flew wide open. The peaceful acceptance completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sudden, intense panic. She gasped violently for air, her skeletal hand reaching blindly into the empty space above her bed. Garrett rushed forward immediately. He caught her cold hand. Martha pulled him down with a desperate, sudden surge of unnatural strength. She dragged his ear close to her trembling, pale lips. Her breath was freezing cold, smelling intensely of damp earth and final endings. She whispered a frantic sequence of words directly into his ear. Her urgent voice barely a scrape against the howling wind outside. Garrett froze completely. His heart hammered a heavy, brutal rhythm against his ribs. The warm color completely drained from his sun-bronzed face. He stared down at the dying woman, his mind spinning wildly from the sheer magnitude of what she had just revealed. Martha slumped back against the thin pillow. The remaining light left her eyes. She was gone. Emmeline unleashed a devastating wail of absolute agony, burying her face deep into the worn mattress, her massive shoulders heaving with uncontrollable, devastating sorrow. Garrett stood paralyzed over them, staring blankly at the shadows dancing on the wall. He placed a rough hand over his mouth, the howling winter wind suddenly feeling like a chorus of dark warning. The sacred promise he had just made was dangerous enough, but the final secret Martha had just spoken changed the entire foundation of everything he thought he knew. The frozen earth offered absolutely no mercy, but the giant woman possessed a relentless, staggering power. Emmeline swung the heavy iron pickaxe high above her head. The thick, corded muscles in her broad shoulders coiled and released with devastating force, shattering the solid, icy ground of the front yard. Each heavy strike against the frozen dirt echoed against the jagged mountain peaks like a solemn, heavy heartbeat. Garrett stood silently on the porch of the dilapidated cabin. He watched the towering, heavily muscular woman dig the final resting place for the tiny, fragile mother. The bitter winter wind whipped his unkempt, shoulder-length hair across his weathered, sun-bronzed face. He made no attempt to step forward and take the heavy tool from the giant woman. He understood the profound unspoken need for a grieving child to perform this final act of absolute devotion. To interfere would be to strip away the quiet dignity the remarkable woman desperately clung to. She worked for hours in the freezing cold. Her torn blue dress offered almost no protection from the biting chill, yet she did not shiver. The sheer physical exertion warmed her massive frame. A fine layer of sweat mixed with the wild dust clinging to her heavily muscled forearms. Despite her overwhelming physical dominance, every movement she made carried a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. She was a colossal giant mourning a delicate butterfly. When the solemn task finally concluded, Garrett helped lower the simple wooden box into the cold earth. They stood together in the stark silence of the desolate frontier, two solitary souls bound by a sacred promise and a highly dangerous secret. "It is time to go," Garrett murmured softly. His voice was a low, steady rumble that cut easily through the whistling wind. Emmeline nodded slowly. She possessed no grand belongings. She carried only a small, weathered leather satchel containing a few faded letters and a carved wooden comb. She walked toward the heavy timber wagon, waiting in the snowy yard. Her thick leather boots crunched heavily against the ice, each step a testament to the colossal physical weight she carried. She climbed into the back of the wagon, her immense weight causing the sturdy wooden bed to groan loudly in protest. She pulled her knees tight against her chest, attempting once again to make her towering, intensely muscular frame appear small and invisible. The cold air bit sharply at her exposed skin, yet she remained utterly silent, accepting the harsh punishment of the winter as her natural due. Garrett climbed onto the wooden driver's seat. He reached behind him and lifted a thick, heavy wool blanket. Without speaking a single word, he draped the warm fabric over the broad, shivering shoulders of the giant woman. Emmeline froze. She looked up at the stoic, quiet protector. Her wide, gentle eyes searched his rugged face for any sign of mockery or disgust. She found absolutely none. She saw only a steadfast, honorable man offering a small token of profound warmth, a tiny, fragile spark of trust ignited deep within her deeply wounded soul. It was the very first time in her entire 20 years of life that a stranger had shown her a genuine act of gentle care. He turned back to the draft horses and clicked his tongue. The heavy wagon lurched forward, beginning the long, arduous journey toward his isolated ranch, located on the far edge of the vast valley. The ride stretched across endless miles of snow-covered plains and dark, towering pine forests. The stark silence between the two travelers highlighted their mutual loneliness. They were both outcasts in a harsh, unforgiving world. Garrett kept his sharp, observant eyes focused constantly on the winding trail ahead. His powerful frame remained entirely rigid, heavily burdened by the immense weight of the final warning the dying woman had whispered into his ear. The sky began to darken, casting long, eerie shadows across the pale snow. The bitter cold deepened, yet the thick wool blanket provided a comforting, unfamiliar sense of absolute safety for the grieving giant huddled in the back of the wagon. Emmeline watched the broad back of the silent horse trainer. He was not a man of grand, empty words. He was a fortress of quiet, dependable strength, a lone sentinel guiding her through the treacherous wilderness. For the first time, since the devastating sickness took hold of the tiny mother, Emmeline felt a strange, quiet peace settling over her anxious heart. She finally belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was only the back of a moving wagon driven by a mysterious guardian who owed a massive debt to the past. As they slowly approached a narrow canyon pass, the distant flickering lights of the frontier town emerged through the falling snow. This was the corrupt, vicious settlement that viewed the giant woman as a terrifying monster. Suddenly, Garrett pulled back hard on the thick leather reins. The heavy draft horses halted with a loud, cloudy snort. He turned around swiftly. His sharp eyes scanned the snowy ridge, located above the canyon road. A solitary rider sat upon a dark horse, holding a long rifle across the saddle horn. The imposing silhouette belonged to a deputy from the town below. Garrett moved with astonishing, immediate speed. He reached into the back of the wagon and grabbed a massive, heavy canvas tarp used for covering winter supplies. "Lie down flat," Garrett commanded. His voice was a harsh, urgent whisper, completely devoid of his previous gentleness. "Do not move. Do not make a single sound." Emmeline obeyed instantly, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stretched her towering, heavily muscular body flat against the wooden floorboards. Garrett threw the heavy canvas tarp completely over her, hiding every inch of her massive frame in absolute darkness. The heavy fabric smelled of old hay and saddle leather. She lay perfectly still beneath the thick cover, listening carefully to the heavy, approaching hoofbeats of the deputy riding down the snowy embankment. "Evening, Garrett," a slow, menacing voice drifted through the freezing air. "Evening," Garrett replied. His tone remained smooth, cool, and entirely unbothered, betraying absolutely none of the frantic tension currently vibrating through his rigid muscles. "You are out rather late," the deputy noted, stopping his horse directly beside the wooden wagon. "Hauling cargo from the old cabin?" "Just timber and iron scrap," Garrett answered steadily. "Nothing of any value for the town." Emmeline held her breath beneath the heavy tarp. She felt the heavy, piercing gaze of the deputy lingering on the covered wagon bed. She knew the town hated her immensely, but the sheer, desperate intensity of the actions taken by her protector suggested a dangerous threat far more severe than simple cruelty. Why did he absolutely refuse to let anyone see her face? What was the terrible secret he was hiding from the law? And why did the survival of the giant woman depend entirely on keeping her existence completely erased from the eyes of the valley? The sharp, echoing crack of splintering timber completely shattered the absolute quiet of the freezing dawn. The isolated ranch sat heavily blanketed beneath a thick layer of untouched winter snow. Garrett stepped out onto the frost-covered wooden porch, pulling his worn ranch jacket tight against the biting, bitter wind. He expected to find the giant, grieving woman exhausted, buried deep beneath the heavy wool blankets inside the warm spare room. Instead, the rhythmic, thunderous sound of a heavy iron maul striking unyielding wood drew his sharp, observant gaze toward the far edge of the southern pasture. Emmeline was already at work, fighting a desperate, silent battle against her own deep-seated fears. She had stripped off the heavy outer layers of her borrowed coat. She wore only her faded, torn blue dress, the sleeveless design, leaving her massive, heavily muscled arms completely exposed to the freezing elements. The icy air plumed around her resolute face with every heavy, labored breath she took. She stood towering over a large pile of raw, uncut cedar logs. With a startling grace that completely defied her colossal size, she hoisted a massive log onto her broad, powerful shoulders, effortlessly carrying a staggering weight that would normally require 2 strong men and a sturdy draft horse. She moved with a relentless, punishing purpose. The thick, corded muscles of her towering thighs strained heavily against the worn fabric as she planted her chunky leather boots deep into the frozen, unforgiving earth. She was single-handedly building a massive fence line, driving heavy wooden posts into the unyielding ground with devastating, earth-shaking strikes. The wise storyteller knows that a deeply wounded creature will always attempt to prove its worth, to avoid being abandoned to the wolves. Emmeline carried a bitter lifetime of cruel rejection upon her exceptionally wide shoulders. Society had always looked upon her towering frame with absolute terror and vicious disgust. She firmly believed that the only actual value she possessed lay in her massive, intimidating strength. She dug the deep post holes with a frantic, desperate energy. She was utterly terrified that if she stopped moving, if she showed even a single moment of weakness, the quiet protector would realize she was merely a useless burden and cast her out into the unforgiving snow. Garrett leaned silently against the sturdy porch railing, his rough, weathered hands wrapping securely around a tin cup of steaming black coffee. He watched the awe-inspiring display of raw physical power with absolute stillness. He felt a profound, unexpected sense of deep admiration swelling warmly within his chest. The vicious townsfolk called her a lumbering, mindless beast, yet he saw only a magnificent, unbroken spirit possessing immense dignity. She possessed the heavy, calloused hands of a giant, but she handled the rough timber with a strange, methodical gentleness, ensuring every single wooden post was perfectly aligned and seated with meticulous care. He had spent his entire life gentling wild, frightened horses. He knew that you could never force trust into a fearful heart. You simply had to provide a quiet, steady presence until the fear finally exhausted itself. Garrett set his tin cup down upon the wooden railing. He walked slowly toward the snowy pasture, his heavy leather boots crunching softly against the morning frost. He did not wish to startle her, knowing all too well the frantic, nervous energy constantly vibrating through her massive frame. "You have moved enough timber for 3 grown men," Garrett observed softly, his low, steady voice cutting effortlessly through the crisp morning air. Emmeline froze instantly, the heavy iron maul suspended high above her head. Her wide, anxious eyes darted rapidly toward him. She immediately lowered the massive tool, wrapping her thick, calloused hands nervously around the worn wooden handle. She looked down at the snowy ground, her towering figure shrinking inward in that heartbreaking, familiar posture of immense shame. "I must earn my keep," Emmeline breathed heavily, her deep, rich voice trembling slightly with suppressed panic. "I eat entirely too much food. I take up far too much space in your home. I will rebuild the entire southern corral before the sun finally sets. I will not be a heavy burden to you." Garrett felt a sharp, painful ache settle deep behind his ribs. He stepped closer, stopping only a few feet away from the towering, muscular woman. He looked directly into her downcast eyes, gently forcing her to acknowledge his absolute presence. "You are not a burden," Garrett rumbled gently, his tone carrying the immovable weight of a mountain. "You are a welcome guest in my home. Guests do not build heavy fences in the frozen, bitter dawn." Emmeline shook her head frantically. The wild, dusty strands of her light brown hair whipped wildly across her strong facial features. "You do not understand the rules of the world. If I do not work, I have absolutely no value. I must pay for the shelter you so kindly gave me. I must pay for the warmth of the fire. The debt is already completely paid," Garrett replied firmly, his sharp eyes holding a deep, unspoken sorrow that mirrored her own. He slowly reached out, placing his calloused hand gently upon the cold iron head of the maul she clutched so tightly. "Put the heavy tool down. Come inside and eat a warm meal." Emmeline hesitated. The gentle, caring command conflicted violently with every cruel, brutal lesson the harsh world had ever taught her. She looked down at his steady, unwavering hands, then slowly looked up at his deeply weathered face. She saw no pity, no disgust, and no hidden mockery. She saw only a quiet, steadfast respect. Slowly, her massive fingers uncurled from the wooden handle. The heavy iron maul dropped onto the frozen earth with a dull, heavy thud. "Thank you," Emmeline whispered softly, a profound sense of fragile relief washing over her rugged features. She turned slowly to follow him back toward the warmth of the cabin, her heavy leather boots dragging slightly through the deep winter snow. Garrett walked a few paces ahead, offering her the quiet dignity of a solitary moment to collect her shattered emotions. Yet, as he casually glanced back over his broad shoulder, his sharp, observant eyes caught a terrifying, deeply alarming detail. Every single time Emmeline placed her full, immense weight upon her right leg, a violent, agonizing shudder rippled up her heavily muscled thigh. She bit down incredibly hard upon her lower lip, desperately stifling a loud cry of sheer agony. She turned her massive body slightly away from him, frantically attempting to hide her right side from his piercing view. As she took another heavy, labored step, the torn fabric of her blue dress shifted slightly in the wind, revealing a dark, ominous stain spreading rapidly across her thick, muscular ribs. The crimson patch was wet, heavy, and completely terrifying against the pale winter morning. She was bleeding profusely, yet she had spent the entire morning swinging a massive iron maul without uttering a single, solitary complaint. She kept her broad shoulders completely squared, forcing herself to walk with an unnatural, rigid stiffness. Absolutely terrified that showing her immense physical pain would result in her immediate banishment from the only safe haven she had ever known. What catastrophic, hidden injury was the giant woman pushing through in complete, desperate silence? And how long could her massive, gentle heart keep beating before the devastating loss of blood finally brought her towering frame crashing down into the unforgiving snow? Garrett stepped forward rapidly, his heavy leather boots crushing the frost with immediate urgency. He reached his rough, weathered hand toward her trembling shoulder, his sharp eyes locked completely upon the terrifying, crimson stain spreading across her thick, muscular ribs. He needed to stop her. He needed to understand. He needed to understand the severe extent of the hidden injury she carried in complete silence, before his calloused fingers could graze the torn fabric of her blue dress. The sky cracked entirely open. The harsh frontier does not pause for a wounded heart. It tests the strength of the spirit without any mercy. A jagged, blinding spear of brilliant white lightning violently struck a massive pine tree located on the high mountain ridge. The deafening explosion of thunder shook the very foundations of the isolated valley. It was not a gentle winter snowfall. A sudden, freak thunderstorm, riding a violent and unseasonal warm front, descended upon the ranch with devastating fury. The torrential downpour hit the frozen earth in heavy, punishing sheets of freezing rain. Within mere seconds, the pristine white snow began melting into a treacherous, sucking sea of dark, churning mud. A horrific chorus of high-pitched, panicked screams erupted from the southern pasture. The sudden violence of the breaking storm sent the herd of powerful ranch horses into a state of absolute blind terror. Garrett spun around instantly, completely forgetting the lingering questions of the morning. His powerful frame surged into motion, sprinting directly toward the chaos. He knew the immense danger of panicked horses in a confined space. They would trample each other to death in their frantic desperation to escape the booming thunder. Emmeline did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She ignored the agonizing, violent shudder ripping through her right leg. She ignored the dark blood seeping heavily into the freezing rain. She turned her massive, towering body toward the frantic screams and charged directly into the heart of the blinding storm. A heavy wooden section of the main corral splintered with a loud, sickening crack. The sheer weight of the terrified herd pressed violently against the timber fence. The heavy wooden posts that Emmeline had meticulously set only an hour prior groaned heavily under the crushing pressure. The gate. Garrett roared over the deafening thunder, pointing a heavy hand toward the rapidly collapsing northern entrance. Emmeline threw herself into the deep, freezing mud. Her chunky leather boots slid precariously, but she drove her immense weight forward with terrifying, awe-inspiring determination. She reached the splintering wooden gate just as the heavy iron latch finally snapped under the immense force of the panicked herd. Two massive draft horses surged toward the opening, their hooves thrashing wildly in the deep mud. Emmeline planted her thick, muscular legs firmly into the shifting earth. She wrapped her massive, heavy arms completely around the thick wooden beams of the swinging gate. The thick, corded muscles in her towering thighs and broad shoulders bulged incredibly under her wet, torn blue dress. She let out a deep, guttural roar of sheer physical exertion, throwing her entire colossal weight against the surging animals. She held the breaking gate entirely on her own. The terrifying physical power required to stop the charging draft horses was absolutely staggering. Her chunky boots sank deep into the treacherous mud, burying her up to her ankles. The freezing rain plastered her wild, light brown hair across her resolute facial features. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut against the driving wind, holding the heavy timber shut with a relentless, desperate courage that completely defied human limits. Garrett plunged into the muddy corral, swinging a heavy coil of thick rope. He moved with the fluid, calculated grace of a seasoned horse trainer, dodging flashing hooves and snapping teeth. He worked rapidly to secure the broken fencing, tying the thick ropes around the unyielding posts to reinforce the barrier. Through the driving, freezing rain, he looked up at the giant woman holding the gate. He saw the immense physical agony etched deeply into the strong lines of her face. He saw the freezing rain washing the dark, crimson blood down her heavily muscled side. Yet she did not yield a single inch. She stood, like an immovable, towering mountain, against the raging storm, sacrificing her own broken body to protect the livelihood of the solitary man who had offered her shelter. In that frantic, chaotic moment, a profound, unbreakable attachment forged itself deep within the mud and the thunder. The stoic protector realized he was not merely sheltering a frightened child. He was standing beside a magnificent, courageous equal. For the very first time in his solitary, quiet life, Garrett did not have to carry the heavy burden of survival entirely alone. He had a true partner in the storm. "Hold the line," Garrett commanded, his deep voice carrying a rare, fierce pride as he tied off the final heavy knot. "I have it," Emmeline shouted back, her rich voice trembling heavily from the overwhelming physical strain. They moved together in a beautiful, unspoken harmony. When one heavy beam slipped, the other was instantly there to catch it. When a frantic mare bolted toward the broken fence, they stepped shoulder to shoulder, using their combined physical presence to turn the frightened animal back into the center of the muddy yard. The brutal violence of the tempest washed away the awkward hesitation between them. There was no space for fear of rejection in the mud. There was only the raw, desperate need to survive, and they relied entirely upon each other to see it through. Slowly, the frantic energy of the herd began to dissipate. The horses clustered tightly together in the center of the corral, shivering violently in the freezing rain, but they no longer challenged the reinforced wooden boundaries. Garrett exhaled a long, heavy breath, wiping the thick mud from his weathered, sun-bronzed face. He turned slowly toward Emmeline, intending finally to demand she go inside and tend to the terrifying wound hidden beneath her torn dress. Suddenly, a massive, ungentled black stallion broke from the center of the exhausted herd. The wild beast was entirely consumed by a fresh wave of blind, unreasoning panic. It charged directly toward the very spot where Garrett and Emmeline stood side by side in the deep mud. Garrett stepped forward, raising his calloused hands to divert the massive creature. But the treacherous mud betrayed his heavy leather boots. His foot slipped violently, throwing him dangerously off balance, just as the massive stallion reared high into the stormy sky. The animal let out a terrifying, high-pitched scream. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the chaotic scene in stark, horrifying detail. The massive stallion thrust its powerful front legs forward, kicking out with deadly, crushing force. The heavy, iron-shod hooves slashed viciously downward through the blinding rain, aimed directly at the space where the two exhausted protectors were standing. A devastating, sickening crack of heavy impact echoed loudly over the rolling thunder. A towering figure collapsed heavily into the freezing, dark mud, completely silent. When the deadly, wild stallion kicked out in the chaos of the storm, did the lethal strike crush the stoic, silent protector, or did it strike the giant, deeply wounded woman already bleeding out in the bitter rain? The iron shashra hoof did not strike the fallen man. Emmeline twisted her massive, heavily corded frame with an agonizing, desperate violence, throwing her entire colossal weight directly into the path of the lashing beast. The heavy blow caught her square upon her already battered ribs, tearing open the hidden gash with a sickening, wet impact. She let out a single, sharp gasp of pure agony before her towering body collapsed sideways, sinking deeply into the churning, muddy mire. Garrett erupted into motion with the terrifying speed of a cornered predator. He did not care about the slipping mud or the flashing hooves of the ungentled stallion. He lunged forward, grabbing a heavy timber rail, left loose from the broken fence, and swung it with devastating, controlled force against the chest of the charging animal. The stallion snorted in sudden terror, pivoting sharply on its hind legs and bolting back toward the safety of the interior herd. The storm roared overhead, but the noise of the tempest faded entirely from the mind of the solitary rancher. Garrett dropped the wooden rail and fell to his knees in the freezing, ankle-deep mud. He reached his calloused, trembling hands toward the giant, motionless form of the woman lying before him. Water ran in muddy streams across her pale, resolute face. Her long, tangled, light brown hair drifted like dark ribbons through the red-tinted water pooling around her ribs. He slid his powerful arms beneath her massive shoulders and her thick, heavily muscled thighs. She was a mountain of a woman, dense and heavy with the solid weight of a lifetime of relentless physical labor. Yet Garrett hauled her upward against his own broad chest with a desperate, frantic strength born entirely of sheer terror. He did not feel the crushing burden of her massive size. He felt only the terrifying lightness of her breath against his wet work shirt. He carried her through the blinding rain, kicking the heavy timber door of the cabin wide open before stumbling inside out of the freezing elements. He laid her gently down upon the sturdy wooden dining table, the only surface large enough to support her colossal frame safely out of the damp dirt. The room smelled of damp wool and cold ash. Garrett moved with a frantic, methodical precision. He ripped the iron latch of the stone hearth open, throwing dry kindling and split cedar into the empty grate until a roaring fire chased the freezing shadows back into the corners of the room. He hauled a heavy iron kettle of water onto the blazing flames, his broad shoulders heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. With trembling, calloused fingers, Garrett carefully cut away the remaining blood-soaked fabric of her torn blue dress. The full, horrifying reality of her injury revealed itself beneath the flickering firelight. The deep gash upon her thick, muscular ribs was dark, inflamed, and leaking a foul, yellowed fluid. The filth of the muddy pasture had poisoned the torn flesh during her hours of brutal labor in the freezing dawn. She had been rotting from the inside out, while she stood like an immovable mountain against the terror of the storm. "You foolish, brave soul," Garrett murmured, his deep voice cracking with an overwhelming, unfamiliar wave of raw emotion. He grabbed a clean linen cloth and boiled water from the kettle, letting it cool just enough before pressing the steaming fabric against her burning skin. Emmeline did not stir. She lay completely rigid upon the wooden table, her powerful chest rising in shallow, painful stutters. The fire cast a warm golden glow across her heavily muscled arms and her wide, powerful shoulders, highlighting the breathtaking, physical power of a woman who had spent her entire existence carrying the suffering of the world upon her frame. For hours, the silent horse trainer did not leave her side. He washed the foul infection from her side, his large hands moving with an agonizing, exquisite gentleness that completely contradicted the brutal scars crisscrossing his own knuckles. He mixed a pungent medicinal salve from the dried roots and leaves Martha had left neatly catalogued in the corner larder, smoothing the dark paste over her inflamed flesh with deep, reverent care. The sun sank lower, dragging the storm away toward the eastern peaks and leaving behind a cold, crystalline stillness across the valley. Yet, the physical wounds of the giant woman were only the surface of the battle. By midnight, the fever seized her massive frame. Emmeline began to burn with a terrifying, white-hot heat. Her powerful muscles spasmed violently beneath the warm wool blankets Garrett had piled over her body. Her teeth chattered a sharp metallic rhythm against the quiet of the cabin. She threw her head back against the rolled quilt, her light brown hair damp with fevered sweat, her resolute facial features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Garrett sat on a low wooden stool beside the table, his weathered cowboy hat discarded upon the floor. He pressed a fresh, cool cloth against her burning forehead, holding her massive, heavy hand securely within his own calloused palms. He felt the frantic, erratic pulse beating wildly beneath her thick skin. He was a man accustomed to silence, a solitary guardian who believed his heart had turned to stone long before the frontier had weathered his face. But watching the giant, invincible woman tremble before the invisible ghost of infection threatened to break him entirely. She began to murmur in the dark, At first, the words were merely a broken, meaningless jumble of sound, lost beneath the crackle of the wood fire. Then, her deep, rich voice grew clearer, rising with the disparate, heartbreaking urgency that pierced straight through the quiet air of the room. "Do not look at me," Emmeline sobbed softly into the fevered dark, her massive fingers tightening around his hand with a crushing, unintentional strength. "Please do not look at the monster in the mirror." Garrett leaned closer, pressing his other rough hand gently over her knuckles. He needed her to hear him through the dark corridors of her delirium. "I am right here," Garrett breathed, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her mind. "You are no monster." Emmeline turned her face toward his voice, her wide, unseeing eyes swimming with the heavy, bitter tears of a lifetime of cruel rejection. She stared past him into the empty shadows of the cabin, her chest heaving with a sorrow so deep it seemed to rattle the very timbers of the floor. What heartbreaking, foundational belief about her own existence did the giant, fiercely loyal woman confess aloud into the empty room, while the fever consumed her mind? And would the stoic protector find the necessary words to save her soul before the morning light finally claimed the valley? The fierce fever finally broke with the gray light of dawn, leaving behind a cold, damp stillness in the cabin. Emmeline drew a deep, ragged breath that did not catch in her burning ribs. Her heavy eyelids flickered open, revealing eyes that were clear of the wild, terror-filled haze of the night before. Garrett sat motionless on the low wooden stool, his broad shoulders bowed slightly with exhaustion. He had not slept. His calloused hands still rested lightly over her massive fingers, anchoring her to the waking world. Emmeline stared up at the rough-hewn ceiling, then shifted her gaze slowly toward the solitary man keeping watch over her pain. The warm fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, casting long, gentle ribbons of orange light across his weathered, sun-bronzed face. She felt the tight, agonizing constriction in her side, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. The dark poison of the infection had receded, defeated by the bitter salves and the relentless, quiet devotion of her protector. "You are awake," Garrett rumbled. His voice was raspy from hours of silence, yet it carried an immense, soothing warmth that wrapped around her wounded heart, like a heavy wool blanket. Emmeline tried to move her massive arm, but a wave of profound weakness washed over her heavily muscled frame. She turned her resolute face toward him, her throat tight with a sudden, overwhelming rush of vulnerability. She had expected to wake up alone in the dirt. She had expected the world to finish what it had started in the freezing rain. Instead, she found the stoic rancher sitting steadfast in the shadows, guarding her breath as if it were his own. "I caused you so much trouble," Emmeline murmured, her deep, rich voice trembling slightly, as she pulled her hand back from his grip out of an instinctive, deep-seated fear of being a burden. "I nearly ruined your home. I bled upon your table." Garrett did not let her pull away. He closed the small distance between their hands, pressing his warm, calloused palm firmly over her thick fingers. His sharp, observant eyes held no trace of annoyance or regret. They held only an unyielding, profound depth that made her massive chest hitch with a strange, unfamiliar longing. "A house is merely wood and stone," Garrett stated quietly. His tone was as immovable as the granite peaks outside. "You are alive. That is the only thing of any importance." Emmeline let out a soft, breathy sigh, allowing her heavy eyelids to drift shut for a brief moment, as a profound sense of emotional safety washed over her battered soul. For the first time in her 20 years of life, she was not an intruder taking up too much space. She was a valued human being, seen and protected in a world that usually only knew how to condemn. The quiet intimacy of the morning lingered in the warm air of the cabin, offering a sweet, deeply earned reward after the terror of the storm. Garrett stood up slowly, his powerful frame uncoiling, as he moved toward the larder to prepare a simple broth to restore her strength. The gentle peace of the new day shattered without a single word of warning. A sharp, aggressive pounding echoed violently against the heavy oak front door of the cabin. The harsh, metallic sound reverberated through the tight space like a gunshot, instantly freezing the warm air into ice. Garrett stopped instantly, his powerful shoulders squared, and his face hardened into an impenetrable mask of stoic restraint. He did not move toward the door immediately. He cast a swift, piercing glance toward Emmeline. The giant woman recoiled against the quilt, her wide eyes instantly flooding with the dark, familiar terror of a hunted animal. Her winced from the ache, her massive muscles tensed beneath the blankets, her instinct screaming at her to rise and run, even though her healing body could barely support her weight. Garrett walked slowly across the wooden floorboards, his heavy leather boots hitting the planks with a deliberate, even rhythm. He reached the heavy oak door and pulled it open with a sharp, echoing creak. A solitary figure stood upon the frost-covered wooden porch, bathed in the pale morning light. It was the same deputy from the canyon road, his heavy badge catching the glare of the sun. He wore a heavy wool overcoat and a smug, unpleasant grin that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Morning, Garrett," the deputy, stepping uninvited across the threshold of the cabin, bringing the smell of cold iron and cheap tobacco into the warm room. "I see you have been busy nursing stray animals." Garrett did not yield an inch of the doorway. His powerful frame blocked the deputy's line of sight toward the dining table, yet the small interior of the cabin left very little room for complete concealment. "State your business and leave," Garrett commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that vibrated with suppressed fury. The deputy chuckled softly, pulling a folded piece of thick parchment from the pocket of his wool overcoat. He tapped the crisp paper against his calloused palm, his eyes darting aggressively over Garrett's shoulder, trying to peer into the deeper shadows of the room. "I have an official order signed by the town magistrate," the deputy announced loudly, his voice echoing with malicious satisfaction. "We received reports of a disturbance at the old southern cabin. More importantly, the valley cannot harbor hazards. A woman of that unnatural size, possessing that kind of terrifying brute strength, is a danger to the entire community. The magistrate has declared her a public menace and a lunatic." Emmeline let out a broken, terrified gasp from the shadows of the table. The vicious words struck her like a physical blow, tearing open the old, unhealed scars of public humiliation and cruelty. The deputy pointed a gloved finger directly past Garrett's broad shoulder, fixing his cold gaze upon the towering, muscular woman lying on the wood. "She is coming with me to the regional asylum in the foothills," the deputy snapped, his voice hard and uncompromising. "We are going to put her in a place where people of her kind are properly managed and caged. Step aside, Garrett. Do not interfere with the law." Garrett stood completely motionless in the doorway, his sharp, observant eyes narrowed into dark slits, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the heavy wooden frame of the door. The terrifying threat had finally arrived, wearing the clean, corrupt badge of frontier authority. The emotional stakes escalated instantly, transforming a quiet struggle of survival into a desperate, moral war against the cruelty of the valley. Emmeline stared at the back of her protector's head, her massive chest heaving with a frantic, paralyzing fear of loss. She expected him to sigh, to look down at the official parchment, and to step aside to protect his own peaceful life from the wrath of the law. She expected him to realize that harboring a giant was a battle he could never hope to win. Garrett slowly turned his head. He looked back at the terrified, wounded woman he had sworn an oath to protect before her mother's dying breath. He saw her immense, heartbreaking vulnerability, and the cold stone inside his chest shattered completely into raw, fierce devotion. He did not look at the deputy. He did not reach for the papers. How far was the stoic horse trainer willing to go to defy the corrupt law and protect a giant woman he had barely known for a handful of days? Before losing everything, he had finally allowed himself to love. The heavy silence stretched across the small cabin like a drawn bowstring. Garrett did not move an inch from the threshold. His powerful frame remained planted before the doorway, filling the space with the immovable weight of a mountain ridge. The smug grin of the deputy flickered, replaced by a sudden, nervous twitch in the corner of his left eye. He looked up into the sun-bronzed, weathered face of the rancher, searching for a sign of hesitation, a single crack in the stoic armor. He found only a dark, unyielding fury burning quietly in the sharp, observant eyes of the protector. "You are standing in the way of a court order," the deputy snapped, his voice losing its smooth, arrogant edge as he shifted his hand closer to the heavy butt of his sidearm. There is no court in this territory that holds jurisdiction over this property without a proper seal from the regional judge, Garrett rumbled. His voice was a low, grinding stone, devoid of any fear, carrying the raw, terrifying authority of a man protecting his own blood. That paper you wave around is nothing more than cheap ink on stolen pulp. Emmeline let out a long, shuddering breath from the dining table, her massive hands gripping the edges of the wool blanket so tightly. Her knuckles turned as white as the snow outside. She stared at the broad back of her protector, a fierce, burning wave of unity washing over her bruised ribs. He was not backing down. He was choosing war with the valley rather than letting the wolves drag her into the dark. The deputy stepped back onto the frosty porch, his boots scraping loudly against the rough wood. He realized the grim truth of the moment. He could not force his way past a towering, furious frontier man in a remote cabin without ending up face down in the dirt with a broken bone or worse. The magistrate will hear about this, the deputy sneered, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage as he backed down the wooden steps. You cannot hide her forever, Garrett. The valley belongs to the law, and the law does not tolerate monsters. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a concussive boom that rattled the iron pans hanging on the corner shelf. Garrett let out a slow, heavy breath, his massive shoulders dropping an inch as the immediate physical danger receded into the freezing morning air. He turned around slowly, his heavy leather boots thudding softly against the floorboards as he walked back toward the dining table. Emmeline pulled the wool blanket higher around her shoulders, her resolute face pale and wet with fresh tears. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, with a mixture of profound gratitude and overwhelming dread. They will send more men, Emmeline whispered, her deep, rich voice breaking in the quiet room. They will bring guns. They will burn this place to the ground just to reach me. You should have let him take the paper. I do not break my word, Garrett stated firmly, his weathered face softening as he reached out to rest his calloused palm gently over her arm. Martha asked for a shield. I am the shield. He winced from the ache. He walked over to the corner where the solitary leather satchel belonging to her mother sat resting upon a wooden bench. The midterm loop of mystery demanded an answer. The vicious intensity of the town magistrate and the sudden obsession with locking the giant woman away had never made sense through the lens of mere social prejudice. Fear of her size was a convenient excuse, but fear of what she represented was the true driver of their cruelty. Garrett picked up the worn leather satchel, carrying it back to the edge of the table, where the firelight shone brightest. He set the bag down carefully, his observant eyes studying the heavy stitching along the bottom seam. He noticed a slight discrepancy in the thickness of the leather base, a double lining crafted by an expert hand decades ago. Emmeline watched him with quiet curiosity, her fever-weakened body resting against the rolled quilt. Garrett used his hunting knife, sliding the sharp blade delicately along the inner lining of the satchel. A hidden flap of dark leather peeled back with a soft, tearing sound, revealing a shallow compartment concealed from the rest of the world for 20 long years. Inside the hidden space lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age and secured with a faded red ribbon. Beneath the ledger rested a collection of official land titles, embossed with the gold seal of the territorial government, and signed by the original founders of the Southern Valley. Garrett pulled the heavy ledger free, carefully untying the faded ribbon. He opened the first page, his sharp eyes scanning the neat, elegant handwriting that had long since faded. Emmeline leaned forward slightly, wincing as her ribs protested the movement. She peered down at the yellowed paper, her massive hands hovering over the edge of the table. The words revealed a staggering, explosive truth. The land upon which the entire frontier town sat, the sprawling timber tracts, the rich grazing pastures, and the valuable river water rights did not belong to the current mayor, the magistrate, or the wealthy landowners who ruled the valley with iron fists. Every single acre of the Southern Valley, including the profitable lumber mills operating 20 miles north, belonged by absolute birthright to Martha and her direct bloodline. Emmeline stared at the documents in stunned, suffocating silence, Her massive frame trembled violently, not from fear, but from the staggering realization of the truth. She was not a beggar. She was not a burden. She was the rightful legal heir to the entire valley. The vicious townsfolk did not want her in an asylum because she was a lunatic or a danger. They wanted her silenced, locked away, and erased from history because she held the signed deeds that proved every building, every fence, and every dollar earned in the settlement was stolen property. The cruelty of the magistrate was a calculated theft dressed up as civic protection. Garrett turned another page of the ledger, his sun-bronzed face hardening into a mask of pure, righteous anger. The ink records detailed the systematic extortion and illegal land grabs executed over the past 2 decades, all signed off by the very men who now wore badges and judicial robes. The betrayal was absolute, running deep through the corrupted veins of the town leadership. Emmeline let out a soft, broken sound, pressing her thick, calloused fingers against her mouth as the weight of the stolen legacy settled over her massive shoulders. Her mother had hidden for fending. Here, in the freezing wilderness for 20 years, guarding the fragile girl and the dangerous secret, waiting for the day when the ledger could finally be brought to light. The emotional stakes reached a deafening crescendo. They were no longer just hiding from the cruelty of the valley. They held the exact weapon required to dismantle the corrupt power structure of the entire region. But the men who had stolen an empire would not surrender their ill-gotten wealth without a ruthless, bloody fight. Garrett closed the heavy ledger with a firm, decisive thud that echoed softly in the quiet cabin. He looked across the table, meeting the wide, astonished eyes of the giant woman. A profound sense of unity sealed their fates permanently together. Yet, as the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows across the yellowed pages of the stolen deeds, a terrifying, lingering question demanded an answer. Martha had hidden the truth from everyone in the valley for 20 years, trusting only one person outside her cabin with the knowledge of her true identity before she died. Who in the town had originally orchestrated the betrayal and the theft of her family legacy, and how deep did the conspiracy run among the men who were even now plotting their destruction? The fire in the stone hearth burned down to a bed of glowing amber coals, casting a soft and steady luminescence across the wooden interior of the cabin. The harsh winds outside had quieted, leaving the mountain wilderness wrapped in a profound stillness. Upon the heavy dining table, the yellowed pages of the ledger rested beneath a clean linen cloth, silenced for the evening, but their presence loomed large over the quiet space like an unexploded charge. Within the warm perimeter of the hearth, the air felt remarkably light, cleansed of the immediate panic that had gripped the room only hours before. Garrett sat upon the low wooden stool, a strip of supple harness leather held firmly between his calloused fingers. A round tin of thick harness oil sat beside his boots, and a small, stiff-bristled brush moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm across the worn surface of a bridle strap. He was a man accustomed to the solitary labor of the night, finding a quiet sanctuary in the methodical repair of weathered tack. But tonight, he was not alone in the dim illumination of the fire. Emmeline occupied the sturdy wooden chair opposite him. She had dressed in a clean, soft cotton shirt borrowed from the spare chest, the sleeves rolled up past her massive, corded forearms. The dark bruising along her ribs still throbbed with a dull and persistent reminder of the storm, but the fever had completely vanished from her skin, leaving her resolute facial features softened by the gentle warmth of the room. She held a broken stirrup leather in her immense hands, her thick fingers manipulating the heavy brass buckle with an astonishing, quiet dexterity that completely belied the sheer size of her frame. They worked in a comfortable, companionable silence. The only sounds in the cabin were the soft scrape of leather, the occasional crack of a cooling coal in the fireplace, and the steady, deep rhythm of their breathing blending together into a single, harmonious pulse. The wise storyteller understands that true intimacy does not require a chorus of grand declarations or noisy conversations. It is forged in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the shared understanding of two souls who have finally found a harbor from the relentless pounding of the world. Garrett raised his observant eyes from the bridle strap, letting his gaze drift slowly across the colossal, heavily muscular woman sitting across the table. He watched the lamplight catch the soft, natural waves of her light brown hair as it fell loosely over her wide shoulders. He observed the way her massive, powerful hands treated the delicate leather with tender reverence. She was a giant of physical dominance, a creature built to move mountains, yet she carried a gentleness inside her spirit that rivaled the softest spring breeze. Emmeline felt the weight of his steady, unwavering gaze resting upon her side. She paused her hands, the broken stirrup strap resting motionless in her thick fingers. She raised her resolute face, meeting his sun-bronzed, weathered look directly. In the past, every time a man had looked at her with such sustained attention, it had brought cruel laughter, vicious whispers, or the cold terror of being hunted. But the amber firelight, reflecting in his sharp eyes, held none of those dark shadows. It held only a profound, immovable respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her entire, authentic self. A strange and unfamiliar sensation bloomed deep within the massive chest of the giant woman. It started as a faint, melting warmth behind her ribs, spreading rapidly through her heavily muscled frame until it reached the tight corners of her mouth. Her lips parted slightly, and for the very first time in 20 years of hardship, grief, and survival, Emmeline smiled. The expression transformed her strong, rugged features entirely, washing away the lingering traces of fear and replacing them with a breathtaking, radiant beauty that belonged to the quiet heart of a home. It was a genuine, unguarded smile, offered without hesitation or shame, blooming in the firelight like a desert flower touched by sudden rain. Garrett stopped the brush in his calloused hand. He stared at the radiant smile resting upon her face, and his powerful chest hitched sharply. The steady rhythm of his breathing faltered, completely disrupted by the overwhelming magnitude of the grace before him. He had spent his entire life behind high walls, believing that his role in the universe was merely to endure the cold and protect the broken without expecting a reward. But watching the giant woman smile in the quiet security of his home made the frozen landscape of his heart melt away in a single, roaring rush of light. He set the stiff, bristled brush down upon the table, the small clatter sounding loud in the quiet room. He did not look away. He leaned his broad shoulders slightly forward, feeling the immense pull of an emotion so deep, so frighteningly profound, that it dwarfed the danger waiting for them in the valley below. They were preparing for an inevitable storm, gathering their strength to face the corrupt men who had stolen an empire. Yet, the only battlefield that truly mattered at this precise second was the fragile, sacred connection forming between their hands. Emmeline lowered her gaze back to the leather, the soft smile lingering warmly on her lips, but the intensity of the quiet air between them vibrated with a sweet, aching longing. She did not feel like a monster. She did not feel like a burden taking up too much space. She felt cherished, protected, and completely, perfectly safe. The fire cast a golden halo across the rugged contours of the room, bathing the two towering outcasts in a peaceful glow. Garrett opened his mouth slightly, his throat dry, his rugged hands resting flat upon the worn surface of the table as the surging warmth inside his chest threatened to overflow the boundaries of his stoic restraint. He searched the depths of his own guarded soul for the right sequence of sounds, desperate to bridge the remaining distance between his silence and her heart. Will the silent protector find the necessary words to express the sudden, overwhelming warmth in his chest before the quiet night yields to the coming storm? The morning sun crested the jagged, frozen ridges of the northern mountains, casting a pale, unforgiving light across the wood and dirt of the frontier settlement. The main street of the town buzzed with the restless, chaotic energy of public market day. Wagons lined the central square, merchants shouted prices of dried corn and salted beef, and children darted between the heavy wooden hitching posts. It was a place that usually wore its prejudices like a badge of honor, a community built upon hidden sins and shared cowardice. Garrett adjusted the heavy leather reins in his calloused hands, his powerful frame sitting rigid and tall upon the wooden driver's seat of his wagon. He did not turn the team toward the quiet back alleys or the hidden logging trails that skirted the settlement's southern edge. He guided the heavy draft horses straight down the center of the main thoroughfare, his sharp, observant eyes fixed entirely upon the crowded public square ahead. Beside him on the bench sat Emmeline. She did not wear a heavy canvas tarp. She did not shrink into the shadows or pull her massive knees tight against her chest to hide her colossal frame from the world. She wore a clean, solid red dress that highlighted the sweeping, powerful lines of her heavily muscled shoulders and the formidable width of her chest. Her long, light brown hair was brushed smooth, falling in rich, natural waves down her back. Despite the white-hot burning of her healing ribs and the lingering ache in her thick thighs, she held her resolute face high, her wide, compassionate eyes carrying a quiet, unshakable dignity. When the towering wagon rolled past the local mercantile, the sharp clatter of iron-shod wheels died away into an abrupt, suffocating silence. Heads snapped toward the street. Voices dropped to stunned, terrified gasps. Merchants froze with handfuls of grain suspended midair. The townsfolk stared at the wagon with wide, horrified eyes, expecting the lumbering, terrifying beast they had whispered about in the dark. Instead, they saw a magnificent, towering woman of incredible physical power looking back at them with absolute, unblinking composure. Garrett stepped down from the wooden wagon, his heavy leather boots thudding against the packed dirt of the public square. He did not rush. He walked deliberately around the side of the wagon, reaching his weathered, dependable hand upward. Emmeline looked down at his outstretched palm. A brief, fleeting shiver rippled through her massive frame as the collective gaze of 100 hostile strangers pinned her like insects on a board. But she looked into the steadfast, unyielding calm of his sun-bronzed face and found her anchor. She placed her thick, calloused hand securely within his grip. She descended from the wagon with an earth-shaking grace, her chunky leather boots hitting the boardwalk with a solid, undeniable resonance. She stood towering a full head taller than most of the men in the square, her heavily muscled frame radiating an awe-inspiring presence that completely silenced the jeers before they could even form on hostile lips. Garrett did not let go of her hand. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the giant woman, his powerful frame forming an impenetrable wall of protection between her side and the gawking crowd. He felt a profound wave of deep admiration and fierce, swelling pride rush through his chest. The vicious townsfolk called her a menace, but looking at the magnificent courage shining in her eyes, he knew she was the strongest, bravest soul in the entire valley. They could point their trembling fingers. They could whisper their venomous lies, but they could never strip away the human dignity he was currently standing beside in broad daylight. The crowd parted slowly, a path of terrified cowardice opening before them as the solitary rancher and the giant woman walked toward the center of the public green. Mayor Vance emerged from the steps of the territorial courthouse, his tailored wool coat spotless, his silver pocket watch chain gleaming in the pale sunlight. His smooth, arrogant stride halted abruptly as he realized who was walking toward him across the square. The color drained from the round, well-fed face of the politician, his thin lips twitching into a hard, nervous line. Behind him trailed the magistrate and 3 armed deputies, their hands hovering dangerously close to their holstered sidearms. "Garrett," Mayor Vance greeted, his voice tight and strained, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. "You are trespassing on municipal grounds with a public hazard." Garrett did not stop walking until he stood mere paces from the steps of the courthouse. He kept his grip on Emmeline's hand firm and secure, his observant gaze locking onto the terrified eyes of the mayor. He did not raise his voice, yet every single word he spoke resonated across the quiet, listening square. "This property does not belong to the municipality," Garrett rumbled, his voice like grinding granite. "And she is no hazard." The mayor sneered, stepping down a single wooden riser to close the distance, his eyes darting frantically toward Emmeline's massive, muscular shoulders as if expecting her to lash out with brute force. The town council declared her a menace. She belongs in an institution, away from decent folk. Emmeline did not flinch beneath the hostile glare of the politician. She tightened her massive fingers around Garrett's hand, her chest rising with a powerful, steady calm. She was no longer a victim hiding in a cabin. She was an equal standing in the light of day, flanked by the only man who truly saw her worth. Mayor Vance leaned closer, his face turning an ugly shade of mottled red as he realized the sheer humiliation of being defied so publicly before his entire constituency. He dropped his gaze to the packed dirt between them, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits. As the crowd watched in breathless anticipation, what retaliatory threat did the corrupt mayor whisper directly to Garrett as they finally turned to leave the public square? The midnight air settled over the isolated ranch like a suffocating blanket of black velvet. The moon remained hidden behind a thick bank of heavy storm clouds, plunging the sprawling pastures and the weathered timber structures into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Inside the small cabin, the fire in the stone hearth had burned down into a silent bed of dying embers, casting a faint reddish glow across the wooden floorboards. Garrett sat at the edge of the dark room, his heavy boots resting unlaced upon the planks. A razor-sharp hunting knife held steadily in his calloused fingers as he cleaned the fine dust from the steel blade with an oil-soaked cloth. The retaliatory threat the mayor had whispered in the public square still lingered heavily in the cold air. The politician had leaned close, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and blind desperation, whispering a dark promise that the ranch would turn to ash before the week ran out. They were not men who accepted defeat quietly. They were desperate rulers of a stolen empire, willing to commit arson and murder to erase the living proof of their crimes. A sharp, acrid scent cut through the night air, piercing the quiet interior of the cabin like a poisoned arrow. Garrett froze completely. The oilcloth dropped from his calloused hand, landing softly upon the wooden floor. He did not need to shout. He did not need to ask. The unmistakable, biting smell of burning cedar and dry straw drifted through the narrow cracks of the heavy timber walls. He sprang to his feet with the explosive speed of a cornered panther, his powerful frame cutting through the dark room. He kicked the heavy oak door open, plunging out onto the frosty wooden porch. The southern horizon was painted in a violent, terrifying shade of orange. The main horse barn was already fully ablaze. High, furious tongues of greedy yellow fire licked hungrily up the weathered pine siding, roaring into the midnight sky with a deafening, crackling fury. A dense, choking cloud of black smoke billowed upward, obscuring the glittering stars and turning the night into a hellish landscape. From inside the burning structure, a frantic, high-pitched chorus of terrified screams and heavy thuds shook the ground. The valuable herd of ranch horses, trapped within the blazing wooden stalls, thrashed wildly against the interior gates as the heat and smoke consumed their sanctuary. Garrett plunged off the porch, sprinting across the churning mud and frosted grass with desperate urgency. He knew the devastating power of a barn fire. The horses would become completely blind with terror, suffocating in the thick smoke long before the flames could even touch their coats. Before he could reach the heavy, iron-bound sliding doors of the burning barn, a colossal, heavily muscular shadow surged past him in the dark. Emmeline had not waited for a command. She wore only a simple gray cotton shift, her long, light brown hair flying wildly around her resolute face like a banner of storm clouds. The dark scars of her healing ribs strained heavily under the cloth, but the sheer, awe-inspiring physical power of her colossal frame erupted into motion with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. She reached the front of the blazing barn before the intense heat could force a normal person to retreat. The massive wooden double doors, reinforced with heavy iron crossbeams and warped by the expanding fire, were jammed completely shut within their scorched tracks. A normal man, even one blessed with the strength of a seasoned lumberjack, would have burned his hands trying to force the heavy latch. Emmeline did not look for a latch. She planted her chunky leather boots deep into the churning earth, widening her stance until her massive, heavily corded thighs resembled thick oak trunks. She raised her colossal, heavily muscled arms, pressing her thick, calloused palms flat against the scorching, smoking wood of the burning door. The intense heat radiated outward, singeing the loose strands of her hair and turning the air around her into a shimmering wave of distortion. She let out a deep, guttural roar of absolute, earth-shaking physical exertion. The thick, corded muscles across her exceptionally wide shoulders and massive biceps bulged with terrifying, superhuman power. She threw her entire colossal weight, backward, wrenching her muscular frame with the force of a falling boulder. The heavy iron bolts shrieked in protest as the thick pine timbers splintered directly out of the stone foundation. With a deafening crash of shattered iron and cracking wood, Emmeline ripped the massive, burning double doors completely off their hinges, casting the heavy structure aside as if it were a fragile toy made of paper. A blinding wave of red fire and choking black smoke erupted from the dark interior, washing over her resolute face. She did not hesitate. She plunged directly into the blazing inferno. Garrett raced behind her, his breath catching in his throat as he watched the giant woman move through the fire like an ancient goddess of unyielding strength. She navigated the burning aisles with a calm, focused grace that completely defied the raging chaos around her. When a heavy burning rafter collapsed from the ceiling, plummeting directly toward the path of a trapped roan mare, Emmeline lunged upward. She caught the burning timber upon her massive, muscular shoulder, absorbing the crushing weight without uttering a single cry of pain, and hurled the flaming obstacle away into an empty corner of the aisle. She reached the primary interior gate, unlatching the heavy iron bar with her thick, calloused fingers and throwing the barrier wide open. "Go," Garrett roared, swinging a heavy leather-led rope and whistling sharply to guide the panicked animals. The herd surged forward, a thunderous wave of flashing hooves and desperate snorts rushing past the towering, soot-covered woman standing in the smoking doorway. Emmeline stood like an immovable, statuesque pillar of power, using her colossal body to block a frightened colt from turning back toward the flames, guiding every single animal safely out into the cool, dark night air until the entire herd stood shivering upon the open pasture, completely unhurt. Garrett dropped the leather rope, turning slowly toward the smoking entrance of the ruined barn. The fire continued to consume the upper hayloft, crackling furiously against the night sky, but the lives of the animals were completely secured. He looked at the giant woman standing amidst the ash and smoke. She was covered in black soot, her skin damp with sweat and red from the blistering heat, her massive chest heaving with heavy, uneven breaths. Her heavily muscled arms displayed the raw, terrifying power that the ignorant townsfolk had condemned as a monster's curse. Yet, he saw only a magnificent, awe-inspiring salvation. A profound, overwhelming wave of deep awe washed through his guarded soul, anchoring him to the earth in absolute wonder. She was a wonder of the world, fierce, tender, and unbreakable. Emmeline lowered her head, wiping the black ash from her resolute face, her massive shoulders trembling slightly from the sudden exhaustion as the adrenaline finally receded from her frame. She looked up at him through the smoke, her wide, compassionate eyes searching his weathered face for any sign of fear or revulsion. Garrett stepped forward immediately, closing the small distance between them, reaching out his calloused hands to gently grasp her soot-covered forearms. He did not speak a word, letting his touch convey the immense reverence and devotion swelling in his chest. Suddenly, a chilling thought struck him like a dash of freezing water. The arsonists had targeted the barn to draw them out into the open pasture, keeping their attention away from the main house. Garrett spun around sharply, his sharp, observant eyes fixing upon the distant silhouette of the dark cabin sitting 50 yards away. The windows of the house were dark, but a faint, unnatural flicker of orange light danced softly along the wooden eaves of the front porch roof. The fire was not contained to the barn. The cowards had split their attack to reach the main dwelling. Did the creeping flames reach the interior of the cabin, where the leather satchel and the priceless ledger that proved her absolute birthright were hidden in the shadows? Garrett erupted into a dead sprint across the frosted yard, his heavy leather boots tearing through the dark grass with immediate, desperate urgency. He left the smoking skeleton of the horse barn behind him, his sharp, observant eyes locked entirely upon the front porch of the cabin. A malicious tongue of orange fire was already licking hungrily up the structural cedar pillar supporting the small roof overhang. He winced. The arsonists had counted upon the burning barn to keep their targets occupied, while a second spark finished the house from the blind side. Garrett cleared the steps in a single, vaulting stride, He grabbed a heavy wooden bucket filled with emergency water from the wash bench and hurled the liquid directly at the burning timber. The hissing steam plumed upward into the dark air, but the stubborn flames clung fiercely to the dry resin of the pine siding. Before he could swing a second bucket, a massive, soot-covered shadow vaulted the railing. Emmeline did not hesitate. She drove her colossal, heavily muscular frame directly into the burning corner. With terrifying, raw physical power, she hooked her thick, calloused fingers beneath the smoldering cedar trim and yanked the burning board clean off the wall with a sharp, splintering crack. She threw the blazing timber out into the dirt yard, stamping furiously upon the remaining embers with her chunky leather boots until the dark night swallowed the last visible spark. The fire had not breached the interior. He winced from the ache. The heavy oak door remained cool to the touch, and the dark corner housing her mother's leather satchel and the priceless ledger remained completely untouched in the shadows. The immediate danger of the flames had passed. But the invisible fire, consuming the giant woman's spirit, could no longer be contained. Emmeline stumbled backward from the smoking wall. The adrenaline that had fueled her superhuman strength during the barn rescue vanished from her blood in a sudden punishing wave. Her massive, heavily corded thighs buckled beneath her colossal weight. She dropped heavily onto the wooden floorboards of the porch, the impact rattling the surrounding timbs. She did not try to stand. She did not attempt to square her broad shoulders or make herself appear small and controlled. She curled her immense frame inward, burying her resolute face deep into the circle of her thick, muscular arms. A profound, devastating sob tore through her massive chest. The sound was raw, jagged, and terribly broken, carrying the accumulated weight of 20 years of loneliness, humiliation, and terror. Garrett dropped his bucket to the deck and fell to his knees directly beside her in the dark. He did not care about the black ash smudging his work shirt or the cold bite of the wooden planks beneath his legs. He reached his rough, calloused hands forward, sliding his palms securely over the sweeping width of her soot-stained shoulders. She flinched beneath his touch, her massive muscles trembling as if she expected a blow. "Look at what I bring to you," Emmeline choked out through her bitter tears, her deep, rich voice cracking violently in the quiet night. "Death and fire, ruin and destruction. The town hates you because of my existence. They burn your barn to the ground because I take up space in your world. I am a curse upon this land. A lumbering monster with heavy hands that only knows how to break things." Garrett tightened his grip upon her shoulders, pulling her colossal, shivering frame closer against his own broad chest. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not speak with the casual ease of a stranger. He spoke with the deep, immovable gravity of a man offering his entire soul as redemption. "Look at me," Garrett rumbled. His voice, a low, steady anchor in the storm of her self-hatred. Emmeline slowly raised her head. The pale moonlight filtered through the drifting smoke, illuminating her tear-streaked, soot-smudged face. Her wide, compassionate eyes swam with a profound, heartbreaking despair, absolutely convinced that her physical difference and her immense strength rendered her unworthy of love. Garrett lifted his calloused hand from her shoulder, moving his fingers delicately upward until his warm palm rested flat against the rough, bruised contour of her cheek. The contrast between his weathered, sun-bronzed skin and her dark, ash-streaked face painted a masterpiece of mutual healing. "You are not a curse," Garrett breathed, his voice vibrating with an overwhelming, fierce devotion that pierced the shadows of her mind. "You are the strongest, most compassionate soul I have ever known. You tore a burning door off its hinges with your bare hands to save innocent lives. You stood tall in the public square when 100 cowards wished to shrink you into the dirt. Your size is not a monster's mark. It is the housing of an angel's heart." Emmeline let out a soft, shuddering gasp. The profound validation washed over her bruised ribs like a cool spring rain, dissolving the thick, jagged ice that had frozen her heart since childhood. She had spent her entire life believing that her massive frame made her unlovable, a freak of nature meant to be caged or hidden away. Hearing the stoic protector validate her spirit with such fierce, absolute truth threatened to alter the very gravity of her world. She leaned her heavy cheek deeper into the warmth of his calloused palm, her massive shoulders finally relaxing their rigid tension. She wept softly, the bitter sorrow giving way to an aching, beautiful relief. Garrett shifted his powerful arms, wrapping them completely around her massive, muscular back. He pulled her against his heart, holding the giant woman, as if she were the most precious, delicate treasure on the entire frontier. He realized that loving her would require fighting the entire corrupt valley, facing guns and arson and social ruin. But the thought brought no fear to his chest. It brought only a burning, radiant clarity. The quiet porch remained bathed in the pale moonlight and the distant, dying glow of the barn embers. They sat together upon the wood, two scarred outcasts who had finally dismantled the high walls, guarding their respective souls. Yet as Emmeline looked up into the steadfast, adoring eyes of the man holding her so securely in the dark, a final, terrifying question echoed softly in her chest. Will the giant, fiercely loyal woman finally allow herself to believe that she is worthy of his complete devotion? Or will the looming shadow of the magistrate's impending attack force her to test the limits of his sacrifice once again? The morning sun rose behind a thick veil of gray mountain fog, casting a pale, cold luminescence over the blackened, smoking ruins of the ranch barn. The charred timbers still hissed faintly where the early frost met the warm ash. Garrett moved through the quiet yard with a grim, absolute precision. He hauled the heavy leather satchel, containing the stolen deeds and the precious ledger, from the safe corner of the cabin, securing the priceless burden deep beneath a false bottom in the wooden storage chest of the wagon. Emmeline stood beside the powerful draft horses, her massive hands guiding the heavy leather strap the harness with a smooth, quiet dexterity. The dark bruising along her ribs throbbed with every measured breath she drew, but her heavily muscled frame moved with a resolute, unwavering power. She wore a heavy canvas work jacket over a plain gray dress, her light brown hair braided neatly down the center of her wide back. She was no longer hiding from the shadows of her past. She was riding out to claim her rightful name and bring the corrupt rulers of the valley before the blinding light of true justice. Garrett climbed onto the wooden driver's seat, his powerful shoulders squared beneath his weather-worn jacket. He reached a calloused hand downward, his sharp, observant eyes locking onto her resolute face. Emmeline placed her thick fingers within his grip, hoisting her immense weight upward with an easy, fluid grace that spoke of total mastery over her colossal frame. They sat shoulder to shoulder upon the bench, the heavy draft horses snorting into the frosty air, before leaning their weight into the traces. Dogged, the wagon lurched forward, leaving the isolated ranch behind as the wheels ground heavily against the frozen mountain trail. They turned their course toward the regional territorial seat, located 20 miles south in the high foothills, where the federal judge held court under the clean seal of the law. The ride through the craggy alpine pass unfolded in a tense, reverent silence. The wilderness rose around them in towering walls of gray granite and dark, silent pines. The wise storyteller knows that the quiet hours before a storm carry an extraordinary, fragile beauty. Garrett kept one hand lightly upon the reins while his other calloused palm rested casually against the wooden bench, mere inches from her thick coat. Whenever the rough terrain jostled the wagon, their arms brushed softly together. Each accidental touch sent a warm electric current through his chest, a profound reminder of the life he was finally allowing himself to embrace. Emmeline glanced sideways at the stoic protector. The harsh lines of his weathered, sun-bronzed face were set in an expression of unyielding concentration. Yet the sharp corners of his eyes held an infinite, profound gentleness whenever he turned to check upon her comfort. She felt a deep, intoxicating rush of emotional dependence swelling within her massive chest. She was no longer an isolated creature wandering the wilderness in fear of judgment. She possessed an anchor, a partner, and a home found within the quiet strength of a man who honored every promise he made. As the trail narrowed, descending steeply into the shadowed depths of Red Canyon, the towering rock walls closed in overhead like the jaws of a giant trap. The natural sunlight vanished entirely from the path, replaced by an eerie, damp twilight where the wind whistled hollowly through the fissures of the stone. Garrett pulled back slightly on the reins, his powerful frame freezing instantly as his sharp instincts flared to life. The draft horses tossed their heavy heads, blowing nervous plumes of white air into the gloom. The warning arrived as a sudden, violent crack of gunfire from the high cliff above. A heavy lead slug tore through the wooden canopy of the wagon, splintering the dry pine with a sharp, concussive snap. The echoes of the shot reverberated off the granite gorge like rolling thunder. 3 armed horsemen emerged from the rocky ledges along the narrow ridge, their rifles leveled directly down at the trail below. They were hired guns, wearing the smuggled authority of the town magistrate, sent to ensure the ledger never reached the federal judge. Garrett did not panic. He moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned frontier veteran. He hurled himself off the high wagon seat, grabbing his repeating rifle from the floorboards as his heavy boots hit the hard stone of the canyon floor. He rolled behind a massive shelf of fallen granite, bringing the steel barrel up and squeezing the trigger with cold, calculated precision. A sharp report answered the ambush, forcing the rider on the left ledge to duck sharply behind a pine trunk. Emmeline did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She ignored the tearing agony in her healing ribs and the strain in her massive thighs. She vaulted over the side of the wagon, her colossal weight landing solidly upon the rocky dirt. She did not cower behind the rocks. With an awe-inspiring, terrifying display of raw physical power, she lunged toward a massive boulder, weighing half a ton that rested precariously upon the edge of the lower embankment. She planted her chunky leather boots into the loose shale, wrapped her thick, heavily corded arms around the rough surface of the stone, and heaved her entire colossal weight upward. The rock groaned, shifting violently against the earth as the thick muscles in her thighs and broad shoulders bulged under her coat. With a mighty roar, she shoved the massive boulder straight down the slope, crashing it into the path of the second horseman's mount and shattering the attacker's line of fire. The canyon erupted into a deafening symphony of cracking rifles, flying splinters, and screaming animals. Smoke from the black powder filled the narrow gorge, turning the air into a thick, stinging fog of gray ash and burning sulfur. Garrett fired again, driving the third gunman back into the rocky crevices above, his face stained with sweat and gun oil, his eyes darting frantically across the clearing to locate the threat. Through the drifting smoke, a sudden, blinding flash of muzzle fire sparked from a hidden notch in the upper cliff wall directly above the wagon. A sharp, wet impact echoed over the roar of the rifles. A towering figure collapsed heavily onto the jagged stones of the canyon floor, the dense air filling with the unmistakable scent of fresh blood. As the acrid smoke slowly clears from the narrow pass, who is bleeding onto the canyon floor? The lead slug had torn through the fabric of his vest and buried itself deep within the thick muscle of his left shoulder. Garrett dropped his repeating rifle, his powerful frame slumping hard against the jagged stone wall of the canyon as a dark, warm crimson stain bloomed rapidly across his work shirt. His breath hitched in a harsh, rattling gasp, and his sun-bronzed face lost the last remaining trace of color, turning as pale as winter ash. Emmeline froze. The roaring wind of the canyon and the cracking reports of the remaining rifles faded into a terrible, deafening vacuum. She did not think about the hidden gunmen retreating up the Rockeye Trail. She did not think about the stolen deeds or the federal judge waiting in the southern foothills. Her entire universe collapsed into a single, terrifying point of absolute reality. The stoic protector, the immovable mountain of quiet strength, who had sworn an oath to shield her soul from the wolves, was bleeding out upon the cold stones of the canyon floor. With a swift, terrifying power, Emmeline lunged across the jagged rocks. Her colossal, heavily muscular frame moved with an astonishing agility that completely belied her massive size. She scooped his heavy, powerful frame up into her thick, heavily corded arms, lifting him as effortlessly as a mother cradling a sleeping child. Garrett let out a low, agonizing groan, his calloused hand brushing weakly against the coarse fabric of her coat. She carried him deep into the secure recesses of a narrow stone alcove carved into the canyon wall, completely hidden from the high ridges where the remaining hired guns might linger. She laid him gently down upon a bed of dry pine needles, and folded horse blankets she dragged from the back of the wagon. The freezing alpine night began to descend into the deep gorge, turning the damp air into a biting, merciless chill. Garrett's breathing turned shallow and erratic, his powerful chest shuddering with every labored intake of air as the cold claimed his sun-bronzed skin. The wise storyteller knows that the deepest tests of the human spirit do not always require the swinging of a heavy axe or the raising of a fortress wall. Sometimes the true salvation of a life lives within the quiet, sacred domestic arts passed down through generations of desperate survival. Martha had taught her daughter how to tan leather, how to mend iron tools, and how to sew torn flesh together with the precise, methodical gentleness of a master healer. Emmeline opened the weathered leather satchel. She pulled free a small, razor-sharp steel blade, a roll of clean, unbleached linen strips, and a heavy iron canteen filled with grain alcohol. She struck a flint against steel, igniting a small, sheltered bundle of dry twigs until a steady, warm flame flickered against the damp stone floor of the alcove. Her massive, thick fingers trembled. The sheer, overwhelming terror of losing the only man who had ever looked upon her colossal frame with pure, adoring reverence threatened to paralyze her hands. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut for a single fraction of a second, drawing a deep, shuddering breath into her bruised ribs, forcing the trembling out of her powerful muscles until absolute, surgical calmness took its place. She stripped away the blood-soaked fabric of his torn work shirt, revealing the ragged, dark hole where the lead slug remained, embedded within his torn shoulder muscle. "You cannot leave me," Emmeline whispered softly into the dark alcove, her deep, rich voice cracking with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "I do not know how to walk this earth without your shadow." Garrett did not answer. His heavy eyelids drifted shut, his powerful frame shivering violently from the encroaching shock in the freezing mountain air. Emmeline boiled the steel blade in a small tin cup held over the flickering flame, letting the metal sterilize before she pulled it free with a pair of flat iron pliers. He winced from the ache. She poured a sharp stream of the burning alcohol directly over the jagged wound, and Garrett let out a low, tortured groan that rattled against the stone walls of the gorge. She did not flinch. With the heavy, calloused hands of a giant possessing an exquisite, miraculous gentleness, she pressed her thick fingers delicately against the torn flesh, guiding the sterilized blade into the dark depth of the muscle with the precision of a seasoned frontier surgeon. She located the heavy lead slug, maneuvered the steel tip beneath the metal, and pried the bullet clean out of his shoulder with a sharp, wet snap that echoed softly in the quiet alcove. Garrett shuddered violently, his head falling back against the folded wool blankets as the burning shock finally pulled the remaining consciousness from his mind. His breathing slowed, turning into a deep, heavy rhythm that barely disturbed the quiet air. Emmeline worked through the freezing hours of the black night with tireless, unbreakable devotion. She tore the clean linen strips into wide ribbons, smoothing the soothing herbal salves over his torn flesh before wrapping his massive chest and shoulder in a tight, methodical bandage. She did not stop there. She stripped off her own damp canvas jacket, draping the heavy fabric over his shivering frame, and crawled into the narrow space beside him upon the cold pine needles. She hauled his heavy, motionless body against her own colossal, heavily muscular chest, pouring every single ounce of her natural body heat and her overwhelming, surging love directly into his freezing skin. She held him through the howling of the mountain wind and the long, dark hours of the frost, her massive arms acting as an impenetrable barrier against the cruelties of the freezing world. The fire flickered low, casting dancing, amber ribbons across the rough contours of the stone walls. The silence of the canyon pressed heavily against the small alcove. Garrett remained completely still, his chest rising in slow, measured stutters, his skin retaining a faint, warm trace of life beneath her protective embrace. Emmeline stared down at his weathered, peaceful face in the dim illumination of the dying embers. A profound, aching, emotional dependence anchored her entire soul to the rhythm of his quiet pulse. She had given him her strength, her skill, and her fierce, unbroken devotion. But the dark hours of the night were growing old, and the gray light of the eastern sky was was beginning to pierce the shadows of the gorge. Will the silent protector wake up before the golden sun rises fully over the mountain peaks? Or is the giant woman destined to be left completely alone in the wilderness once again? The morning sun crested the jagged granite rim of Red Canyon, casting a long golden shaft of warm light down upon the cold stone floor of the hidden alcove. The lingering mountain fog retreated rapidly before the advancing heat, leaving the air crisp, clear, and smelling faintly of scorched pine and damp earth. Garrett stirred beneath the heavy canvas jacket. His broad shoulders twitched, and a low, dry cough rattled against his bandaged ribs as consciousness slowly pulled him back from the dark abyss of fever and shock. He winced, his weathered face tightening into a sharp scowl, as the throbbing pain in his left shoulder flared to life. He did not open his eyes immediately. He felt the solid, comforting weight of a colossal, heavily muscular arm resting securely across his chest. Emmeline was leaning over him, her resolute face etched with profound exhaustion, her light brown hair falling in a tangled braid across her wide shoulder. She had not left his side for a single, solitary second through the freezing black hours of the night. Garrett let his heavy eyelids flutter open. He stared up at the rough-hewn stone above them, then shifted his sharp, observant gaze toward the magnificent woman guarding his breath. Emmeline caught the movement instantly. Her wide, compassionate eyes widened with a sudden, radiant rush of relief. She sat up straight, her massive frame uncoiling with an earth-shaking grace, her thick, calloused fingers reaching out with exquisite gentleness to press the back of her hand against his sun-bronzed forehead. "You are breathing," Emmeline murmured, her deep, rich voice trembling with an overwhelming tide of unshed tears. "The fever has left your skin." Garrett drew a slow, deliberate breath that did not catch in his wounded shoulder. He shifted his powerful frame slightly against the folded wool blankets, his rough hands reaching up to grasp her thick wrist, anchoring her to his view, just as she had anchored him to the earth through the dark hours. "I am alive," Garrett rumbled. His voice was raspy like grinding gravel, but it carried an immovable, absolute certainty. "Because you did not let me fall." The quiet alcove remained wrapped in a sacred, domestic peace, the reward of earned survival and deep emotional dependence. Yet, the shadows of the past still lingered within the deep recesses of his memory, demanding the final, complete honesty that the core loop required. He had carried the crushing burden of a 20-year secret upon his broad shoulders, a dark guilt that had shaped every solitary day of his existence in the lonely valley. Garrett turned his face toward the stone wall, gathering his strength, his calloused fingers tightening around her wrist with a quiet, desperate intensity. 20 years ago, Garrett began, his voice dropping to a low, hollow scrape that barely disturbed the quiet air of the canyon. "I was a foolish, reckless boy working the timber camps in the northern hills. I possessed a loud mouth and a desperate need to feel important among men who measured worth in gold and violence." Emmeline sat motionless, her massive chest rising in a steady rhythm, her wide eyes locked completely upon his weathered face. She did not interrupt. She offered him the sacred space of a soul finally unburdening its darkest sins. "Mayor Vance and the men who now rule the settlement were older then," Garrett continued, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. "They were young speculators hunting for unclaimed tracts, buying off judges and stealing water rights across the foothills. They cornered me at the local tavern. They bought whiskey until my head spun, and they asked questions about the old Southern Valley. They asked if anyone lived in the deep timber near the shadow peaks." A solitary muscle twitched along his sun-bronzed cheek, the weight of the old memory pressing down upon him with physical cruelty. "I told them," Garrett whispered, his voice cracking with a sharp, agonizing wave of self-loathing. "I boasted of a lone cabin hidden in the thick brush. I described the old woman and the small girl with the giant stride. I thought it was merely tavern talk. I thought they were just curious surveyors looking for timberland." Emmeline let out a soft, barely perceptible gasp, her thick fingers trembling slightly within his grip. 3 days later, Garrett stated, his sharp eyes swimming with dark, unhealed torment, "I rode past the southern ridge and saw the smoke. I saw the men carrying the heavy iron lockboxes and the leather ledgers from the cabin. I realized what my careless, drunken tongue had unlocked. I tried to confront them on the trail. They beat me until my ribs cracked, and they threw me into the freezing river, leaving me for dead in the mud. He paused, his heavy breathing hitching in his chest as he met the steadfast, unblinking gaze of the giant woman. Martha found me, Garrett rumbled, his voice thick with a profound, overwhelming reverence. She dragged my broken, freezing body out of the freezing water. She hauled me to her cabin, washed the mud from my face, and stitched my torn skin together. She knew I was the fool who had brought the wolves to her door. She knew I was the reason she had to spend 20 years hiding in the dark, guarding her child and her stolen empire in absolute terror. Emmeline stared down at the stoic protector, her massive frame shivering slightly, not from the mountain chill, but from the staggering magnitude of the revelation. She did not curse me, Garrett breathed, a solitary tear finally breaking free to slide down the weathered contours of his cheek. She looked into my bruised eyes and gave me a second chance. She healed my body, and then she looked me in the eye and made me swear a single, solemn oath. She made me promise that when her final day arrived, I would find her grown girl, bring her to my home, and stand as an impenetrable shield against the very men I had originally betrayed. The silence in the stone alcove deepened, pressing against them with the weight of an ancient truth. The core loop that had driven the entire narrative was fully revealed, not as a tale of random charity, but as a profound, beautiful redemption born from forgiveness and sacred duty. He had protected her because he owed his very breath to her mother, but he had stayed and loved and fought because Emmeline's magnificent soul had claimed every corner of his damaged heart. Garrett raised his rough hand, pressing his palm flat against the bruised contour of her cheek, his observant eyes searching her resolute facial features for any sign of betrayal, anger, or disgust. Emmeline felt the immense truth of his confession, washing over her massive chest. She knew that he had carried the original sin of her family's exile upon his frame for 20 years. She knew that his careless boyhood tongue had set the fires of her hardship into motion. Yet, as she looked down into the steadfast, adoring eyes of the man who had torn a burning barn door off its hinges with her, who had bled upon the canyon floor to protect her name, she felt no anger. She felt only an overwhelming sacred grace. He was as scarred by the past as she was, bound to her by a shared redemption that the harsh frontier could never break. The golden sunlight poured fully down into the rocky gorge, bathing the hidden alcove in a brilliant, warm illumination. Garrett rested his head back upon the wool blankets, his rugged hands still lingering over her cheek, his chest rising with the heavy anticipation of her final judgment. As the morning breeze swept softly through the stone walls, will this devastating revelation of his past sins drive the giant woman away into the wilderness, just as they have finally found each other in the dark? Or will her magnificent, compassionate heart offer the ultimate, healing forgiveness that changes their destiny forever? The heavy silence of the hidden alcove did not stretch into a gulf of rejection. It dissolved instead into the quiet, sacred warmth of an absolute, unreserved grace. Emmeline did not pull her hand away from his weathered cheek. She did not rise to flee into the cold wilderness, nor did she let the ghost of his youthful betrayal cast a shadow over the truth of who he was today. She leaned down, her massive, heavily corded arms wrapping securely around his powerful, bandaged frame. She pressed her face gently against his sun-bronzed neck, her deep, rich voice vibrating against his chest with a profound, immovable forgiveness. The past was merely ink on yellowed paper. The present was the beating heart of a man who had bled upon the stones to keep her safe. They were both broken vessels, mended by the unyielding grace of a second chance. 2 days later, the strength returned fully to his stride. They emerged from the deep shadows of Red Canyon, not as hunted outcasts dodging shadows, but as an undeniable, majestic presence. They drove the heavy timber wagon straight through the southern foothills, arriving at the columned steps of the territorial courthouse just as the morning bell tolled across the high regional seat. The federal judge, a stern man with silver spectacles and an unblemished reputation for upholding the law, sat behind his polished oak desk. He examined the yellowed leather ledger, the embossed government seals, and the signed original deeds presented from the false bottom of the wagon chest. The document spoke with a thunderous, unassailable authority that no amount of municipal corruption or hired muscle could silence. There was no violent, bloody showdown in the streets. The weight of absolute truth acted as an iron gate closing upon the architects of the valley. Within a week, federal marshals arrived in the frontier town with warrants bearing the highest judicial signature. Mayor Vance and the corrupt magistrate were stripped of their badges, deposed from their stolen offices, and led away in quiet disgrace to face a formal accounting of their extortion and land theft. The valley was returned to its rightful lineage, but the land itself was merely a foundation for a far more enduring victory. Garrett and Emmeline returned to the isolated ranch beneath the brilliant, clear blue sky of early spring. The blackened skeleton of the old horse barn did not remain a monument to ruin. Together, utilizing their combined strength and an army of hired local carpenters who finally dared to stand on the side of justice, they raised a magnificent new structure of stout cedar and shining iron. Emmeline walked the sprawling pastures in her solid red dress, her chunky leather boots crunching evenly against the reviving earth. He winced from the ache. She no longer pulled her knees tight against her chest or attempted to shrink her colossal frame into the background. She stood at her full, staggering height, her massive shoulders squared, her heavily muscled arms displaying the extraordinary physical power that the valley now recognized not as a menace, but as a symbol of protection and strength. The vicious whispers of the past withered entirely away, replaced by the quiet, respectful nods of neighboring ranchers who knew that they, giant woman, possessed a heart as tender and pure as an alpine stream. Garrett worked beside her in the sunlit yards, his left shoulder mending slowly under her watchful, meticulous care. He was no longer a silent, solitary sentinel, hidden behind high emotional walls. Whenever he paused his labor to watch her lift a heavy timber or gentle a skittish foal with her calloused, giant hands, a radiant, unobstructed warmth filled his chest. They spoke little, preferring the language of shared glances, steady touches, and the quiet harmony of two lives completely intertwined. The sun settled low over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sprawling valley in soft ribbons of gold and amber light. They stood together upon the front porch of the fully restored cabin, watching the long shadows stretch across the pristine pastures. Garrett reached out his calloused hand, his fingers lacing securely with her thick, powerful grip. Emmeline turned her resolute face toward him, her lips parting in a breathtaking, genuine smile that reflected the brilliant colors of the evening sky. They had conquered the shadows of the past, defied the corrupt rulers of the frontier, and forged an unbreakable sanctuary of dignity, belonging, and profound, wholesome romance. The Valley of Giants was finally at peace. As the campfire embers fade into a soft, glowing ash, and the mountain night wraps the valley in its quiet blanket, we realize that the most formidable barriers we face are not the towering cliffs of the wilderness, nor the cruel judgments of a fearful world, but the silent walls we build around our own wounded hearts. Emmeline and Garrett teach us that true strength is never measured by the weight we can lift or the enemies we can outrun, but by the courage it takes to bear our deepest scars to another human being and allow ourselves to be truly seen. Forgiveness is the ultimate alchemy of the soul. It takes the bitter ashes of yesterday and turns them into the warm, enduring hearth of tomorrow. No matter how heavy your hands may feel, or how deeply the world has misunderstood your journey, love always reserves a quiet room for those who dare to open the door. May you carry this quiet memory with you through the miles, finding your own steady anchor in the storm, and knowing that every broken road can lead, in its own time, to a place where you finally belong. This story is a work of historical fiction set in an idealized, family-safe, and cinematic frontier landscape. All characters, names, and specific events are products of the author's imagination and creative adaptation. The narrative is crafted purely for emotional entertainment, wholesome romance, and dramatic reflection. It contains no graphic violence, gore, or mature themes, adhering strictly to family-safe PG standards and wholesome storytelling guidelines. Any resemblance to actual historical figures, living or dead, or specific real-world legal events is entirely coincidental.